Good morning. We'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Sunday School Review. This week's Sunday School lesson is entitled A Covenant Renewal and is taken from Nehemiah, the 10th chapter, verses 28 through 39. Now, the author of this book is Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah was an influential leader, and he led the third wave of exiles from Babylon. And his mission, his role was to rebuild the wall and Jerusalem, rebuild the wall, and to rebuild the faith of the people. Now, in chapters 1 through 7 of Nehemiah, it's dealing with the rebuilding of the wall. Now, at this time, as I said, this is the third wave, not the first or second wave of exiles from Babylon, but the third wave. Now, by this time, the temple, the restored temple, or the temple had been rebuilt. We talked about that last week, and we said this was the second temple. This was not Solomon's temple. This was the rebuilt temple at Jerusalem. So the rebuilt temple had been completed at this point about 70 years. And so now Nehemiah was sent to rebuild the wall and rebuild the people's faith. And as I said, chapters 1 through 7 deals with Nehemiah and the rebuilding of the wall. And when we get to chapter 8, that's where our lesson starts, in chapter 8 of Nehemiah, chapter 8 of Nehemiah. And we're going to go to chapter 8 of Nehemiah, but our lesson starts at verse 28 of the 10th chapter, not the first verse. But let's look at the first 3 verses in Nehemiah chapter 8. And this again from chapter 8 through 13. That is, through the rest of Nehemiah is talking about rebuilding the people's faith. Okay, let's look at verse 1 of chapter 8. And it says, and all the people gathered themselves together as one man in the streets. Okay, so basically they were unified. We have all the people were there, they gathered together. That was before the Watergate, and they spake unto Ezra. And we was in Ezra last week, and we talked about the fact that Ezra was a scribe and a priest. Ezra was a direct descendant of Israel's first high priest, that is Aaron. Okay, so we see here, they spoke unto Ezra the scribe, and also, as I said, he was also a priest, bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord hath commanded of Israel. And this, as I said, the lesson is the covenant restored or renewed. Okay, so bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord commanded to Israel. And Ezra, verse 2, and Ezra priest, and Ezra the priest, brought the law before the congregation, both men and women, and all that could hear and understand with understanding upon the first day of the 7th month. Okay, that's verse 2. And verse 3 says, he read therein before the streets that was before the water gate from morning until midday, before the men and women and those that could understand, and the ears of all the people were attentive unto the book of the law. And if we look at we drop down to verse of 6 here. It says, Ezra blessed the Lord, the great God, and the people answered, Amen, Amen, with lifting up their heads, and they bowed their heads and worshiped the Lord with their faces to the ground. So, after Ezra, the priest, had read the law, they their hearts were convicted. Okay, their hearts were convicted. In other words, they had confessed that we have sinned, we made a great error, a grave error. And let's read another verse in chapter 9 of Nehemiah. Chapter 9, verse 2. And the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. So basically they're saying we not only confess our sin, our individual sins, but we confess the sins of our fathers or our forefathers, okay, for what they have done. So the people now is going to pledge to obey the covenant. Okay, that's basically what this is about, the covenant renewal. And the people are going to pledge to obey the covenant of God. Okay, so that's chapter 8. I read a couple of verses from 3 verses from chapter 8 and 1 verse from chapter 9, talking about the people confession of sin. Now, when we get to chapter 10, that's where our lesson starts, in chapter 10. But let's look at, we're not going to read them. Let's look at verse 1 through 28 of chapter 10. And this is talking about the renewed covenant that the people promised to obey. And this is all the lesson is about. The people made a covenant or restored covenant. Now, this may have been the first time they're making it, but their forefathers made a similar covenant, okay? But they are going to agree to fulfill the covenant that was, let's put it this way, that was delivered to Israel, their forefathers. Okay, and in chapter 10 of Nehemiah, the very first verse, these are the names from verse 1 through 28. These are the names of the people that sealed the covenant or to sign the covenant. And if you look here in verse 1 of chapter 10, Nehemiah is the first name on the list. Okay, and that's the only name I'm going to read, and you can look and read the rest of them. You see, Nehemiah was the first one to put his, as they say, his John Hancock on this covenant. So Nehemiah is the leader. He signed his name first. And this is what the people are vying to do. This is what they are making a vow to the Lord. And our lesson starts at verse 28. And there are two outlines in our lesson. And the very first outline is people commitment. Start at 28, people commitment. And we see the names in verse 1 through 27 of the people that sealed it or signed it. And now we're going to get to the people. Now, in other words, as they say in the law, that it was unanimous consent, unanimous support. So everyone supported this covenant. Everyone that was able to understand supported this covenant. And that's where we get into the people commitment. Verse 28, the first outline is people commitment. The second outline is the law restatement. That's verses 30 through 39. The first outline is verses 28 through 29 of chapter 10. Okay, let's take our first set of scriptures, that is people's commitment, and we're going to read where our lesson starts, verse 28. And the rest of the people, when it said the rest of the people, those that you see listed in verses 21 through 27. Now the rest of the people, here's the rest of the people. And the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Neothans, they all made a vow to God. Okay. This was the beginning of their restoration process. Okay. Of establishing a relationship with God. For many of them, they were establishing a relationship. For probably some, they were reestablishing the right relationship with God. So this is the beginning of that, establishing this right relationship with God. Okay, and verse 28 it said the rest of the people, other than those that are listed that signed it, the rest of the people, the priests, the Levites, the porters, the singers, the Nethian, they all made this vow to God. Okay, this is the beginning of their restoration process. That's 28a. Now 28b said, and all they that had separated themselves from the people of the land unto the laws of God. Now we know that God had instructed Israel to not to uh, intermingle with the people of the land for fear that they would lead them astray, which they did. Okay, that was the very purpose of him. Don't get involved, don't get entangled with the people of the world. They worship strange God, they do all type of strange stuff. Don't get involved with them. That's tantamount to our scripture that don't entangle yourself. Don't get too wrapped up in worldly affairs because it can lead you away from God. And that's what happened. Okay, that's what happened. So God wanted there to be a separation, and even today, there should be a separation between what's holy and unholy, what right and righteous and what unrighteous. There should be a separation. There should be a clear line. The line shouldn't be blurred. Okay, that's what separation is about. Is making a separation so you won't get carried away. And that's what happened to Israel. They got involved with the nations around them and they got carried away. Okay. That's that's where the separation comes in. Okay. And we're gonna get more into that. Okay. From the people of the land, their wives, their sons, their daughters, every woman knowledge and have understanding. So you say, okay, now why don't why didn't the Lord want Israel marrying the people of the world? Either he didn't want the daughters marrying the sons and the sons marrying the daughters. Okay, it was because they would, for fear of them being persuaded, carried away. That was the reason for separation. Okay, but they were doing that and they got carried away because they worship strange gods and all of this, and that's why. And the scripture talks about not being unequally yoked. Now, and we might touch on it a little bit later, but it's not talking about rate along racial lines. However, some people, and maybe some people even still today, allege that that's what that means. Being unequally yoked means racial line. No, it does not. It means along belief, faith. Okay, that's what it means. It doesn't mean, it doesn't have nothing to do with racial identity, as some may allege. That's not what that's talking about. Okay, but being unequally yoked is talking about beliefs, talking about religious faith. Okay, that's what it's talking about, not along racial lines. No. Okay, that was verse 28b. Let's do 29. Okay, it says singular voice. They clave to their brethren, their nobles, and entered into a curse and into an oath to walk in the law of God. Okay, this is they vowing to do this. They vowing to do this. Walk in the law, walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all the commandments of the Lord our Lord, and his judgment and his statute. In other words, as I said before, they made a promise. They all that understood, they made a promise to obey the laws of the Lord. As I said, it was unanimous support, unanimous consent, and this was the promise or the oath that they made. And less that was verse for really the first outline. So the people commitment was an oath. In other words, basically what they're saying, this is essentially what they're saying, says we agree to do this, and to show that we are serious, we're going to make a covenant. Going to make a covenant. It's just like you're going to buy some land, some property, and you go and you say, I want to make an offer on this property. The first thing that the agent or the broker is going to tell you, if you want to make an offer, you need to put down some earnest money to show that you're serious. I can't take this offer to the seller and there's no earnest money deposit. Is this guy serious? So to show that they are serious, they're going to put it in writing. They're going to make a covenant. They're going to make an oath or vow that we will do this. Okay. And the second outline is the law's restatement. Okay, and that's chapter 10, verses 30 through 39. We're going to start at verse uh, 30 first. And these are rejected in a marriage. That's what it says. Rejected in marriage. And that we would not give our daughters unto the people of the land and take their daughters for our sons. Again, like I said, this is talking about rejecting intermarriage. I'm sorry. It says intermarriage, not interracial. I want to be clear. It is not saying interracial. It says rejecting intermarriage, not interracial marriage, intermarriage. But that's what they term it today, interracial, and that's why they said the Bible is against interracial marriage. No, the Bible is not against interracial marriage. It says we will not give our daughters unto the people of the land, that is the Gentiles, and nor our daughters to the people of the land, nor take their daughters. In other words, our sons are not going to take the daughters of Gentiles. Okay, they want the separation, and again, the reason I say is because the nation, the Gentiles, would have negative influence on the Jews and lead them into idolatry, lead them astray. That's the was the fear. It wasn't. It wasn't. It really interracial, and like it is today. It's not interracial. It's interfaith. You don't have the same belief system, and that can lead astray. In our lesson, they give an example where there was a couple that were started talking to each other, or you might say dating each other, and they was of a different faith. And the lesson said the closer they came together, the further away they got from God. So that's the whole idea is, and some people let success, education, things of that sort lead them further away from God. As people say, once you if you ride in the church bus, you don't have your own car, you ride in the church bus, you faithful. You there every Sunday. But as soon as you get a car, well, you there every other Sunday, then maybe once a month, and then you don't come but every third month. Well, where were you? Oh, I was in Montreal. I spent the weekend in Montreal. What? I mean, the point is, the more successful you became, the further away you got from God. The more education you got, the further away you got from God. The more money you accumulated, the further away you got from God. That's not the way it should be. So that was the purpose of the separation, where their influences, their negative influences, wouldn't rub off on you and draw you away from God. There's nothing wrong with success. There's nothing wrong with money. There's nothing wrong with education. But if that's going to draw you away from God, that's a negative. It don't have to be a negative, but if it does, it is a negative. Okay, but so that was the purpose of of rejecting into marriage, because with the nation, with the people of the land, because it could draw you away from God, and that's what it did. Okay, and so that was the first thing they said. Well, we are not going to do this. We're going to reject that. That's what verse 30 says. Verse 31 says, talking about keeping the Sabbath. If the people of the land bring ware or any victual buy, bring ware or any victual on the Sabbath to sell, that we would not buy if of them on the Sabbath or on the holy day. And okay, let's deal with that part. Okay, so basically, they're saying we're going to keep the Sabbath. They weren't to do any trading, any business deals on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was a day of rest. It was a day to focus on spiritual things. We weren't going to do any trading, any buying and selling on the Sabbath day. Okay, we're going to respect the Sabbath, right? We're going to keep the Sabbath as holy, as a day of rest. We're going to honor and respect the Sabbath. That's what we go. This was their promise. This is what we're going to do. We promise to do this. And 31b said, and we will leave the seventh year and the extraction of every debt. Okay, the seventh year. Now that was the seventh year. Even everything rests. The land rested. They was not to do any planting of crops on the seventh year. The land would rest. Even the land got to rest on the seventh year. Okay, and the debt was, if there was any debt, there was a relief period for the debt. The debt was to be forgiven. Okay, so that's what they agreed to do. That was part of the agreement, right? That was part, and frankly, that was part of the law. So they just agreeing to do what was in the law, really. The Sabbath rest was in the law. The about the land resting on the seventh year was in the law. The thing about forgiveness of debt in the law. They're just agreeing to uphold the law of Moses. That's really all they're doing. They're just making it, putting it in writing. Let's say making a covenant. Okay, that was verse 31. Let's go to verse 32, and this is supporting the temple. So they rejected into marriage. That was verse 30. And 31, they vowed to keep the Sabbath. Don't do any buying or selling on the Sabbath. And then 31b, they about the land resting on the seventh year, and about the extraction of debt. Debt was to be relieved and after the appropriate time. Now let's go to verse 32 and support the temple. Okay. Also, we made ordinance for us to charge ourselves yearly with the third part of the shekel for the service of the house of God. So basically they promised to support the temple, support for the temple. This is their promise. It was called a temple tax. They vowed to support the temple. In verse 32, a third part of a shekel for the service of the house of God. That is the temple. Okay, verse 33, and this is part of supporting the temple. Okay, verse 33, for the shewbread, and these are the things that the Levites needed to support the temple, for supporting the temple. Okay, for the showbread, for the continual meal offering, for the continual burnt offering of Sabbath, of the new moons, for set feasts, for the holy things, and for sin offering to make atonement for Israel, for all the work of the house of our God. So this is what they are vowing to do to, if you want to say, to fully support the temple work. And verse 34, and we cast lots among priests, the Levites, and the people for wood offering to bring into the house of God after the house of our fathers, at times appropriated year by year to burn upon the altar of the Lord our God, as it's written in the law. So the people made a commitment to the temple, and let's finish reading it. These other verses here, up to verse 37. Okay, and this is talking about these are additional promises here. And 35, to bring the first fruits of our ground. This is that promise, to bring the first fruits of the ground, and the first fruits of all, the first fruit of all fruits of all trees year by year unto the house of the Lord. That's 35. This was another promise. the promise to do this. Okay, verse 36 was the second promise here. Also, the firstborn of our sons, of our cattle, as is written in the law, and the firstling of our herds and of our flock, to bring to the house of God unto the priests that minister in the house of God. Okay, so and let's talk about the first fruit of our sons. Now this here basically is to the firstborn son was to be consecrated or dedicated. That's basically what we're talking about. For divine purpose. We're not talking about sacrificing them as pagans. That we're not talking about offering them to gods and sacrificing them. No, we're not talking about that type of sacrifice. We're talking about dedicating the firstborn. In other words, the firstborn would be dedicated, okay, for a divine purpose. That's what that our firstborn son. So the firstborn son is to be dedicated or to be for divine purpose. That's the concept of the firstborn. So like a firstborn dedication. The firstborn is to be dedicated for divine purpose, not to be sacrificed, not to be killed, okay, but to be dedicated. Now, we know about the sacrifice of Abraham. That was the test of Abraham's faith when he was commanded to offer up his son Isaac. Okay, that was to test Abraham's faith. And it brings in the substitution and all that. We're not going to go into that. But the firstborn of our sons is talking about dedicating them for a divine purpose. That's the type of dedication we're talking about there. Just want to make that clear. Okay. And that's what that is talking about. So we go to verse 37, okay, 37a. This was the third promise. This was another pledge that they made. This was another pledge in verse 37a, that we should bring the first fruit of our dough and our offering, the first of all manner of trees, of wine, of oil, unto the priest, to the chambers of the house of our God. And as I said, this is another pledge that they made, or another oath that they made, okay, that this is what we will do. In all of these pledges that we're reading about right now is for support of the support of the temple. Okay, they made a promise to faithfully worship. So it's really three areas that they committed, or three things that they committed to do. They committed to faithful worship. That's one, faithful worship. And they committed to support of the temple by offerings and tithing. And this is what we're talking about here, giving offering, giving tithing to support the temple, to support the temple. And the Levites, that's why I mentioned the Levites, they were the one in charge of the offerings and in charge of the temple. That's why it's mentioned the Levites. They were the responsible persons, or the responsible tribe or group that was responsible for this. Okay, so the three areas of support for the temple was faithful worship. We agreed to do these things. We agreed to worship faithfully and offering and support and tithes and offering. And let's look at 37b, talks specifically about the tithes. It says right there. And the tithes of our ground unto the Levites. That's what I say. That's why I mentioned the Levites. The Levites were the one in charge of the temple. They was in charge of taking the offering. That's what they were charged with the duties of. Okay, the tithe of the ground unto the Levites, that the same Levites might have the tithes in all the cities of our tillage. In other words, that was their job, is to receive in the tithing. Okay, and that's what they agreed to do in support of the temple. Faithful worship, offering, and we just talked about 37 was talking about offering. Says first fruit of dough and our offerings. Says it right in the verse, offerings, and supported the temple. And now in verse, well, in 37b, it talks tithes and supported the temple. Okay, so now we go to verse 38 and 39, the last two verses in our outline, and it says tasking of the Levites. And the priests, the son of Aaron, as I said and early about a few lessons ago, that the priests came from the Aaron, Levi. Okay, all priests come from all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests. But so the priests are the son of Aaron. So if he's a priest, it has to be from the son of Aaron. Son of Aaron shall be with Levites when the Levites take tithes. It says right there. All okay, has to be a son, a direct descendant of Aaron, shall be with Levites when the Levites take the tithe, and the Levites shall bring the tithing, shall bring up the tithes to the tithes unto the house of God, to the chamber, and to the treasury house. So you see there clearly that that was a responsibility of the Levites. Okay. And verse 39, which is our last verse, here says, for the children of Israel and the children of Levi shall bring the offering of the corn, of the new wine, and the oil unto the chambers, where are the vessels of the sanctuary, and the priests that minister, and the porters and the singers, and we will not forsake the house of God. So basically, what they are saying, the last clause in this verse is saying, this is the essence of, we will not forsake the house of God. This is the promise. This is the oath that they made. In other words, if we've ever done it before, we will no longer forsake the house of God. Okay, so they will give generous support for the house of the Lord. And this is the whole idea today. The Lord wants us to have a generous heart, okay, and supporting the work of the Lord, okay. And we go back to the very beginning of this when David had this idea to build God a house. David doing after David was a man of war, but then David he saw, well, I live in a very nice house, but God dwelling in under a tent, Okay. Now we know the essence of God does not, okay? But the presence of God was represented by the tabernacle and things of that sort. But that represents God's presence. But David wanted to do something better, okay, for the Lord. So we should have an idea to support the ministry, support the house of God. And that's what these people had forsaken for many years, for many years. And some of them are those who weren't yet 70 years old, because as I said last week, they were in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. Now, many of them survived, because when they built the renewed temple, they were weeping. Some were weeping, some were shouting. Those that were older than 70 that had seen the first temple. So there were many that were older than 70 years old, but some had never seen the temple. So the point is, some really didn't have an idea what a real relationship with God looked like. Okay, but I mean, after they had been made aware of what the nation had went through, and how, and really when the law was read, we read it where Ezra read the law, and they could see, man, we have strayed way away from the mark. Okay, and it's almost like, how do we get out here? They don't even know how did they get that far off course, but they was way off course, and they vowed to as they say, right the ship. Okay, they are vowed to right the ship, and that's what the commitment is about. That's what the law restated is. It's the same law of Moses, but it's to a different generation. These people weren't there. These people didn't come through the wilderness. No, I mean, 40 years in the wilderness. No, the people that did that, they way dead. Okay, and as I said, some of the people that was in Babylon, some of them was born in captivity. They don't know anything about Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem, but they was made aware. And once they were made aware, they realized that they have strayed far away from the mark, and they made a vow to establish for some and to reestablish for others a right relationship with God. And that's what the lesson is about. The covenant renewed. It's about establishing a right relationship with God. And that's our lesson today. We like to thank you for watching. We ask you to join us next week for another edition of the Sunday School Review. Thank you.